Today's guests are Mike McQuaid and John Britton. They met while working together at GitHub. Mike and John are the founders of Workbrew, a startup built to provide the missing enterprise features for managing Homebrew. Mike is the project lead and longest-serving maintainer of Homebrew, applause, the package manager for Mac that almost every one of you will have used. I used it today to install Docker. We get the inside story on Homebrew, including its London pub origins.
I would never have imagined that it began in a pub in London with a random chat.
I mean, I guess the naming and the beer theme might have led one slightly more in that direction.
We learn what it's been like to work with the biggest company in the world, Apple.
He's based in the Shetland Islands of Scotland. If you look at a map, Shetland is far away. Essentially, that's the short version. Someone in Apple being like, oh, we have to get this thing here. Like, can it not just go to an office or a bigger city or whatever? And it's like, we can't. Like, if you want this to happen, this is what you need to sort out, right?
We learn how Mike and John think about open source sustainability.
You will find various parts of the internet that don't like me very much for this viewpoint. But in the end, to me, the only way you are able to successfully scale that is you say some of these features go away.
And how Mike and John are taking these lessons forward to build Workbrew with a very unique approach. Enjoy.
Probably everyone listening has used Homebrew, to manage their packages on Mac, unless they're like really hardcore on Linux or Windows. Do you want to talk a bit about the actual story of Homebrew? Because this is a tool that we all use.
Yeah. So I just want to say something about the hardcore Linux users, is that I would say that both Mike and I kind of came to be as hardcore Linux users and ended up in this situation of working on a Mac because of its similarity to Unix operating systems, but there was something huge missing there. And I think that the story of Homebrew's origin and whatnot that Mike will tell is definitely going to encompass that as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess as John said, I almost mentioned this earlier, but yeah, for me, I realized recently, I think I was a, Linux user for, 5 or 6 years primarily. And less than a year after moving from Linux to Mac OS, I ended up maintaining Homebrew. So that's, how I ended up over there. Occasionally when Linux people give me trouble, I point out I have one commit in the Linux kernel from back in the day, 2000 and whatever year it was. So yeah, that's my nice little Linux fight back thing that I have.
But, Linux credibility.
Yeah, exactly. Also, fun fact, Homebrew itself runs on Linux nowadays as well. So we might talk about that later because it's sometimes a little bit confusing why you would want to do that. But anyway, so right, we're back in 2009. I'm working in London for a startup called Mendeley. There's a guy called Max Howell also working in London for another startup called Last.fm. He has irritations with the way package management is currently working on Mac. He's been playing around with Mac ports and think, and can't remember, there was one other option that leaves my mind right now. And I think he was whining about it in the pub one day, and basically someone said to him, hey, if you hate package management and you know all this stuff so much, why don't you make your own package manager? I think mainly intending him to just shut up. But he went off and started work on Homebrew. It's interesting. You can kind of go back and look through the Git logs. It's like one of the kind of few examples, I guess, of a big open source projects that was started with kind of Ruby driven development. So the first project commit in Homebrew itself is like a description of how Homebrew is going to work. And Max wrote all that down before he wrote the code. And I often think that's a sign when things are going to be optimized for usability and developer happiness, as you think from the outside in, think how should people be interacting with this rather than just writing code and then being well, they interact with it how I tell them to. Anyway, so he'd been working on this for a little while. He open sourced it. It started to get picked up by a few more people. I discovered it because I've been I basically built a sort of hack on top of Mac ports to make it work in the way I didn't know at the time, but this Homebrew tool worked, to use a lot more stuff from the system. So it'd be kind of faster to build various tools. I discovered Homebrew. I was like, this is cool, and sort of just started getting involved. And yeah, I think one other non-Max person had kind of been getting involved as a maintainer at that time. And yeah, I guess fast forward 15 years, we've got kind of gone from, a few contributors, a few maintainers to we've got about 30 maintainers. We've got about, I think, 15,000 or something contributors, maybe more than that, and 20,000 packages kind of in our like officially supported ecosystem, and then probably tens of thousands more in the kind of wider ecosystem.
That's so cool. I would never have imagined that it began in a pub in London with a random chat.
I mean, I guess the naming and the beer theme might have led one slightly more in that direction if you pondered it sufficiently.
Yeah, that makes more sense now. Wow. So, Mike, could you just tell me what you just told me about WorkOS? Because I just told Mike that WorkOS is the sponsor, and this is what Mike said.
Yeah, so WorkOS isn't paying me any money for this. I pay WorkOS money for this, but WorkOS is like one of the best developer tools I've like ever used. It's the documentation and the experience with building with them is so good. Like I initially was almost like, okay, this seems expensive, but then like I built an integration with them in about 20 minutes that I had spent 2 days banging my head off the wall trying to build it directly with Okta, and then with WorkOS I then have like many SSO providers like supported instead of just one. So yeah, like for me, WorkOS is one of the nicest developer experiences I've encountered in the last like 5 years probably. And it's not surprising because a bunch of the developer team are ex-GitHub and therefore very good at their job.
Amazing. Thank you, Mike. And was it a case of like build it and they will come?
I don't think so. I mean, the funny thing in open source land, back then we used to talk a lot more about this than we do now when it's, there's a bit more of like, oh, clout and you should get some GitHub stuff on your resume or CV or whatever. Like back then I remember people said a lot of open source is just scratching your own itch, right? Where essentially Max had a problem himself that he wanted to solve primarily for himself. And then he was like, okay, well, I'll put this on. At the time, also quite new, this thing called GitHub. And I guess that was the other sort of interesting thing. And it's been interesting for me kind of being on both sides of that is like Homebrew was also one of the first software projects, certainly the first package managers to kind of really lean in heavily on the kind of GitHub way of doing things, right? So Max from the outset, I guess he would say that he was being lazy. I guess, maybe he was being lazy, but he was also being smart. The best engineers, in my opinion, are often fairly lazy. Because he had the attitude of like, hey, I don't want to maintain this all myself. I want to have the community maintain this. And if you want the community to maintain it, you need to make getting involved, contributing, merging pull requests, all this type of stuff, like as easy as possible. So that was a big focus of his in the early days. And that was, I guess, a big focus of mine increasingly with Homebrew and GitHub and things like that, is that generally you want to take the behaviors that you want people to do in a developer tool and make them as easy as possible. And if the stuff you don't want people to do, you want to make that either impossible or harder for them to do than the easy thing, than the right thing.
That makes sense. And what does that like functionally kind of look like?
To me, in something like Homebrew, it looks like, I guess it depends on what layer you look at, right? So part of it is essentially we really try and optimize the friction of like onboarding, I guess, both from a user level and a contributor level and a maintainer level. So for a user, Homebrew was, I think, maybe one of the first projects, maybe the first to the now infamous, like, get a bash script and pipe it into curl that some people don't like very much. And if you don't like that for Homebrew, then you might want to hear more about Workbrew later. We'll talk about that. But I guess from that perspective, it was like, well, a lot of these tools that have installers you have to interact with, whatever, having something where you can like get it installed with like a single command, no dependencies, everything gets done for you. Like that was very heavily optimizing for the user. Similarly for contributors, we try and have the docs, the automation, the tooling, everything like that, such that the flow is as optimal as possible for that person getting started with the project. And when we see people bump into the same problem multiple times, we're quite aggressive about jumping on them and really prioritizing fixing that stuff, because that's how the project scales, basically. And we have still very, very many more contributors than we have maintainers. And then the last thing for maintainers is similarly doing that for the maintainer approach, and they're making it easy for us to add new maintainers, but also making it easy for maintainers to do their job, trying to automate the absolute living hell out of everything we possibly can, trying to lean into like robots, automation, whatever, CI all over the place, linting all over the place, to try and essentially just remove the amount of manual work that a human has to do that can be done by a robot or a CI or a GitHub action or whatever it may be.
I mean, this is really what makes it possible for such a relatively small team of volunteers to run a huge part of the infrastructure of Mac development. It's like unbelievable to me, like how like small but mighty that group of people is, and they deserve like all the accolades and all the support for, as a developer myself, I'm a user of Homebrew. I use it every day. I couldn't imagine living without it, and it's just like unbelievable that it's possible to do something like that with such a small dedicated crew.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it almost feels like I don't know if I ever really thought about like, oh, where did brew come from? It's like such a like inherent part of like using like developing with Macs. It's like such a did like Apple get involved in it at all?
Not really. Like, so they've helped us out periodically. So we have contacts at Apple who we can kind of escalate stuff to and help us out there and ask questions of and stuff like that. I guess the most notable case of Apple helping us out, because obviously they realized that it was very much in their self-interest in that case to do it, was when there was the Apple Silicon transition. Pretty much as soon as they announced like they were going to move to Apple Silicon and there was these developer kits and stuff like that, they got in contact with us straight away and were basically, hey, like we want to get a bunch of these kits in the hands of your maintainers, and we also want to like get these kits in data centers so you can start building stuff in CI and automating things and packaging things and integrate that into your workflow, and you're not having to like pay out the nose for a lot of this stuff. Even that process was kind of an interesting case of like worlds colliding, because there was conversations with some of the Apple folks. Some of them knew already. Some of them were like, okay, so where's the Homebrew office? And it's like, there is no Homebrew office. Okay, okay. So what country are your maintainers based in? Like
everywhere.
We've got like 30 maintainers, maybe like 20 countries, right? And I remember like one of the folks who was very early with like getting a lot of our stuff sorted out, and he's a Workbrew employee nowadays as well. And he's based in the Shetland Islands of Scotland. So like, if you look at a map, Shetland is far away. Essentially, that's the short version. And yeah, basically like someone in Apple being like, oh, like how, like we have to get this thing here. Like, can it not just go to an office or a bigger city or whatever? And it's like, no, we can't. This is like, if you want this to happen, this is what you need to sort out, right? And it did all get sorted out, and it was all fine. But it's definitely an interesting cultural thing. And I think Apple, like, I'm a massive Apple fanboy. I basically own essentially almost everything they've ever made, with the exception of the Apple Vision Pro. And I'll take one if anyone wants to give one to me for free. But
if anyone's listening,
a bit too expensive for my startup lifestyle right now. But but like, I think they're great, but they definitely like don't quite get open source, right? Like there's certain teams and individuals in the organization who have that background or relationships or whatever, but like organizationally is like a high level, like they're not like super tuned in onto almost like how to partner with a bunch of volunteers with no legal entity scattered around the world.
Yeah, it's actually really surprising that they're not just like giving bucket loads of money to you guys. I don't know.
Well, I mean, this is a lot of the discussions around open source right now, really, where it's like, well, why? I'm actually not being too facetious here, hopefully, but like, why should they? But they don't have to. Like
yeah.
Homebrew is operating fine without getting buckets full of money from Apple, and from both parties' perspective, it would be hard to justify going from nothing to buckets without some sort of like understanding of what that relationship is, some sort of quid pro quo. And that's when you have a volunteer nonprofit scattered around the world, and maybe the world, I haven't checked,
close
right
to
now,
the largest company in the world,
biggest company in the world, right? Like there's an imbalance there. And also maybe it's pertinent to maybe the way things are going right now, where there's an awful lot of debates in and around open source right now, and I'm maybe one of the old school open source, maybe even free software people, where I'm like, well, kind of the point is they don't have to give you anything. Like, no, I don't feel like any company who uses Homebrew or relies on Homebrew is obliged to give any money to Homebrew. Like a bunch of them do, and that's great when they do, and we really appreciate that, and it's really useful for us. But if the license, if we demanded that every company over a certain size gave us money, then in my mind, we're not open source software anymore. We're a different thing. We're a proprietary product with a free tier, right?
My message would be like, don't try to use open source as a playbook. Build your product, get people to use it. Like the idea that open source is a marketing strategy is something I just see like way too often.
Yeah.
And I guess it depends what you're optimizing for, right? If you're trying to maximize reach, then yeah, sure, make it open source, put it under the most liberal open source license possible, the MIT license or whatever, let everyone in the world use it, right? But then converting those people into paying customers later is not something that you have built your relationship on the back of, right? And it's funny because I guess the open source is not a business model. Like in some ways, I think like open source is a short-term business model. It's not a long-term profit-making business model. And it's one that when these companies get bigger and zero interest rates and investor pressure and all these types of things happen and you get squeezed more, then it's like, well, to what are you able to go back to your, like, whoever, maybe your community, your investors, your customers, your employees or whatever, and say, hey, all this open source thing we did, like, turns out changed our mind.
Bad
We're
idea.
not going to do that anymore. And I think John and I share a similarly bad taste in our mouth from places that have done that, where it's not even that they're necessarily doing the wrong thing. It's just, you cause a lot of aggro when you do that you don't. And that aggro ends up feeling like it is open source's fault. Whereas I think it's the exact opposite of that. It's when you expect open source to be something that it's not.
That makes sense. And yeah, it's like it definitely is like one of the biggest conversations right now. I think even like the whole WordPress stuff is like largely this kind of like whether you should pay things that you're not obligated to, whether you should contribute to things that you're not obligated to. And
I mean, I think this comes back to like looking at the origins and looking at the licensing. For me, it's like we have this internal company value that we talk about all the time, which is don't give what you'll later have to take away. And when you think about open source, like what you're really doing is if you come from like the free software background, even it's like the freedoms, the freedom to copy, the freedom to change, the freedom to distribute, all of those like core tenets. It's like, if you're starting from a place where you're telling everybody this is what you're giving them, then of course the internet is going to be mad at you when you change that. Whereas like from our perspective, the idea of, building a business around open source is that this is an open source project. It's open for anybody to do what they want with it, right? And that doesn't have to change. You can come along and build a business related to it or try to solve more problems related to the same problem space and not put yourself in the position where your entire business model is like hinging on the fact that you need to change something about the way your open source project works, right? Like, I think I'm not actually familiar with the situation with WordPress. I've only like read over it like very briefly. But there's definitely this case of open source projects where there's like a valuable service and the business model is like provide support, or the business model is provide a hosted version. And to turn around and say, we're the only people that can provide the hosted version is a big challenge, right? And that's what a lot of these like kind of come down to is like, hey, we invested all of this effort into building an open source project, and now we're going to like try to retain for ourselves the ability to be the only one to sell it as a hosted service. And that just seems very challenging to operate and to execute, and it doesn't really jive with the expectations of what people want out of open source. And so I just think that that's like a flawed logic. I think it's a much better idea to say there's a huge infrastructure, people get a lot of value out of it as it is, and if there are missing bits, why not go build those bits and sell those additional bits to people that are not that are kind of complementary. And that's I think this brings us really easily into the concept of Workbrew and how we're building this, is that it's the missing pieces. Mike uses this analogy of like the Lego set. If you think about open source and you think about the code and the available modules as like the standard bricks, right? You can go and build whatever you want with the standard bricks. But when you buy that set that's the Millennium Falcon, it's got all these pieces that are super custom to your exact use case, and those are the bits that we build and sell, right?
You've got Chewbacca's,
right? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, they're not. The Chewbacca is too specific to like your company. You know, like
Mhm.
that makes total sense. And I guess there's like it's also reassuring in the sense of like the open source part. Like you you couldn't even if you wanted to do like a massive rug pull and be like, hey, Homebrew no longer open source, like or whatever. Like because you're working on a project that I guess Homebrew is not part of Workbrew. It's something that you're heavily affiliated to, but you don't own Homebrew. You're like building on top of Homebrew as well, right?
Yeah, I think Mike should talk about this like in a little bit of detail.
I mean, for me, this sort of relates to like why Workbrew, why now as well, because various people over the years, including John, for the last
10 years,
maybe more than 10 years, have been like, hey, you should go and make like a Homebrew company, right? And I've been like, nah, I don't like that idea, right? And I think like for various reasons, but one of those reasons was the fact that Homebrew was in a place that there was a risk that would have happened 10 years ago, right? That like if a big injection of VC happened to go into something around, in the Homebrew ecosystem, that you could quite easily capture that project because everything was so nebulous, right? Whereas now Homebrew has its own governance structure. Like I'm the project leader of Homebrew, as was mentioned, but I am literally elected to that position every year, right? Like it just so happens no one has run against me and no one has ever been elected except me since we've had that position, but that's not a guaranteed thing. And if I were to really annoy everyone involved in the Homebrew community and all the maintainers, like I would not get reelected, right? Like someone else would run and they would win and they would be in charge of Homebrew and I would not be, right? So it's that structure means, as well as boring licensing detail stuff that I won't get into, essentially it means that Homebrew is its own thing. It's a community run project and it will remain that way essentially forever, right? Workbrew may or may not be like involved to some degree with Homebrew, like past, present, future, whatever. But like the idea that Workbrew could somehow capture Homebrew and take it over is not possible, right? It's set up in such a way that is not a tenable option. In some ways, the model that I actually like the most, and I don't work there anymore, so I'm not obviously being paid to say this, but like the relationship Git and GitHub had, I thought was like, I think that's when we look at like the relationship like a big successful company has with an open source project, like that's the one that internally we kind of jive with the most, because it's like, was GitHub involved with the development of a bunch of features in Git? Sure. Like, did GitHub help the adoption of Git? Like 100%. But back in the day when like GitLab and Bitbucket and various other kind of relatively mainstream Git hosts were around, like GitHub was not trying to like eliminate the competition or fork Git or like find a way to basically be like, everyone who uses Git on their own server needs to somehow pay us money, right? Like that was never a thing. But I also think the growth of Git and the growth of GitHub has gone hand in hand. And if you looked back, and even just being a Git user, right, there's a bunch of, I guess maybe because I knew some of the Git people at GitHub, like I know there's a bunch of features in modern Git that would not be there had it not been for GitHub employees working full time on building those features, right? And we can say the same thing about Workbrew and Homebrew. Like in some ways, the features are less substantial right now. We're still a baby company, right? But there's still stuff in there in Homebrew that you can use today, which was not there and would not be there were it not for the company that we have built in the Homebrew ecosystem, right? And that's there for all the open source people to use however they want.
Yeah, that's actually really cool. And I really love the kind of comparison. I don't think I've ever heard anyone even make the link between Git and GitHub in the sense of like, like this is, like people do it with a lot of like, I don't know, like people complain about like this project is too tied to this one company. You never hear that about GitHub, which is really cool as well.
If anything, the thing you hear people periodically complaining about on
it's the opposite
Orange site is people being like, hey, people can think GitHub and GitHub are the same thing and they're not, and isn't that bad, right? Like, and it's, I don't think GitHub cares very much about that, basically about not being associated one-to-one with Git, because they feel like that's not necessary for them, right? They've grown a brand which is bigger than Git, right? And that's, I think the way that both parties handled that relationship is admirable, really.
other ways to look at that too is that like similarities between Git and GitHub and between what we're doing with Workbrew and Homebrew is that, Git is kind of the behind the scenes, like technical enabler of the product. But, the stuff that really made GitHub successful, it wasn't just about Git. Like obviously there was like timing with Git and decentralized version control and easy branching and merging, all that stuff. But like, obviously collaboration and the pull requests were the big drivers of the success for them. And I think that it's similar, for us too, that it's like, there's this underlying architecture that Brew is the best way to get software onto a machine. There's a huge opportunity to do more than, just the libraries that developers care about. There's a huge opportunity for teams to have shared environments and do things that don't make sense in a single player model and a multiplayer model. And so, we look at that as the opportunity that we have to add a lot of complementary functionality and, build a business on that. Another kind of company that I really admire in this space of, it's not quite open core. Like GitHub is not open core, right? Like it's not, they control Git and that's their thing. It's this complementary style. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with a company called Tailscale, but they're a really amazing kind of, I want to call them like a VPN company, but it's not quite a VPN. It's a peer-to-peer tunneling, like overlay network tool, but it's built off of this open source project called WireGuard. And, people don't really make the correlation between Tailscale and WireGuard unless they're really nerdy about it. But it's this underlying enabling open source technology that they build kind of a multiplayer peer-to-peer administration layer on top of, and they run, all these like web servers, and they do like stun tunneling, and they do, NAT traversals, and they do all this complicated networking stuff that you could do yourself, but really there's a huge value in them doing it for you. And what's cool about it is it's like all of that additional functionality makes WireGuard feel like magic, and that's their product. And it's like WireGuard is the underlying enabling technology. And I think that, for us, similarly, Brew is the underlying enabling technology that's really awesome. And we want to bring a bunch of magic to teams, right? Bring it to the companies. They can say, get your engineers up and running as fast as possible on day one. Make sure that anybody who makes a change to the developer environment, it works for everyone. So you're not repeating yourselves over and over again. When something goes out of date, you can patch it really easily. When there's a vulnerability, you can fix it right away. You know about it. You can, remediate. You can look and have an audit history of what's going on. Like all of this stuff is really, really valuable from a business perspective. And it's not something that, the open source community is like eager to build. Like I don't see a lot of open source engineers in their free time saying, what does this $1 billion company need to make them successful with my open source project? Let me spend my time working on it for free, right? So we can build some of those bits and sell it to them.
And I mean, that was in some ways the earliest motivation for Workbrew, really, was like we sort of decided on this, we're going to build a commercial layer around Homebrew before we nailed down the exact ideas. But the exact ideas came from a set people in the Homebrew community, including one grumpy Scotsman who may or may not be a very, I don't know, whatever adjective you want to use to describe me. Like I said no to a lot of these things over the years when people would come from a big company and say, my compliance requirements mean that I need to ABCD. And it would be a non-trivial lift for the Homebrew folks. And I'd be like, no, we're not going to do this, right? And periodically I would check in with the other maintainers and be like, I'm just making sure that like no one's super passionate about doing this, right? And they're all like, no, don't want to do this.
How about Homebrew open source project receives a request from very large company to complete your security questionnaire?
Yeah, exactly. Classic example, right? But I mean, I found this actually like a previous job. So like back when I was a Linux guy, I worked on KDE, like the Linux desktop environment. And one of the things I was really excited about back then is I worked for a company called KDAB, who are like a consultancy company around Qt, the tech that KDE was built in. And I was really excited because they were like the biggest contributor to KDE of any like company. Right. So I joined and I was like, oh, I'm going to get to do all this open source work for free, and it's going to be, for money, and it's going to be really exciting and whatever. And then I learned that like a lot of the open source work for money work around this stuff is the stuff that's less fun, right? Because all of the fun jobs, that's the stuff that they don't have any problems getting volunteers in their spare time to make sure that they do this. But like essentially when you have a spec and you need to regression test the hell out of something to make sure that like you behave in the same way as some, equivalent software on Windows or a bigger open source project or whatever, and you want to just like nail that down such that you completely implement every part of the specification, right? That's not so fun, right? Like, but it is something that is really valuable and important to big companies, and that they will pay for people to do, right? And in some ways, I'm also inspired by that model here, right? Where it's previously with those organizations, it wasn't that I was saying like, your problem is not a problem, right? They did have problems and they wanted us to solve them, but it's like, we can't solve that for you, right? Like, we're not the right people. We're not qualified well enough. And in some cases, even when people would come along and make pull requests to kind of add some of this functionality, some of that functionality, it was like, well, now no one's using it, so it bit rots. And then a year later, someone tries to use it again. It doesn't work because Homebrew doesn't use it, right? And 99.99% of Homebrew users don't use it. Whereas now we have a world with Workbrew with this functionality where it's like we have customers using this stuff every single day, right? So if the open source project has an issue there, we jump on it and we fix it within minutes or hours, right? Instead of it being like a year of this thing just being broken, right? So yeah, I think it's a different way of doing this stuff and thinking about this stuff. And I think it's where people are best aligned, right? We in Workbrew are best aligned to solve these problems for customers. And we do it with some open source software, some proprietary software, and we do some stuff for free and some stuff for money, right? Whereas Homebrew is best aligned to do what suits the majority of the community to kind of coalesce behind the stuff that works for 99% of people, right? And if you're in some very niche use case or 0.1% or whatever, then it's probably not going to be as good for you as something like Workbrew might be.
This is also the convention over configuration or simple defaults or solving the case for the majority of people. There are a lot of things in Homebrew. I'm not a maintainer, but I'm a contributor to Homebrew, and I'm a heavy user. And there are some things in Homebrew that don't work the way I want them to, but kind of the consensus is like, this is the way it is because we need to make life manageable for the maintainers. If we changed it, the support load or the burden of maintenance would be much higher. So we've optimized for, the Homebrew project has optimized some things for maintainers rather than for users, in the sense that like, this always works. It never has a problem. We're never having to support it. And so kind of the idea of the project, the open source project, is kind of the one true way to use the thing that applies to the most people and is the most reliable and the most robust and the easiest to maintain and keep up to date. Every time a new Mac OS version gets released, Homebrew is ready and waiting, right? Like, that's an impressive accomplishment for the project. But when it comes to, big companies, something that we learned at our time at GitHub was that, a small company of 100 employees telling a company with 100,000 engineers how to build software is kind of laughable. The idea that the 100-person company knows how 100,000-person companies should be running their software teams, and that, controls aren't necessary, right? Like these kind of like very, very basic ideas, right? And the reality is that those really big companies or the companies that have these kind of requirements, they get a lot of value out of the ability to customize things, to have checkboxes and have options, and to be able to say, this is the way we work. How can we make this tool fit our working style rather than having to conform to what's there? And so another thing that we kind of took away from our time at GitHub and what we kind of emphasize with Workbrew is that, the idea of configurability is kind of a debt that you have to maintain and a burden. And, the open source project is not really willing to do that in some cases. But for us, that's something that we're willing to sell. We're willing to take the time to maintain, to make this thing work for various sizes of companies with different controls and security and compliance requirements and all that kind of stuff, and make that our value add to make it fit your needs. And so I think it's just like a great opportunity to work work on an open source project, but also have a for-profit model. And it's not really open core. It's not really like an open source company. It's more of like a complementary business to an existing open source company or an existing open source project.
I mean, I guess to me, that comes back in some ways to the title of the podcast, right? This is Scaling Dev Tools, right? And in some ways, there is the open source way and there's the business way. And I think where it gets messy or people get confused is when they try and combine the two. So there's a lot of talk about sustainability in open source nowadays, right? And I've been, moderately critical on the internet and more loudly critical in person at conferences and stuff like that about the idea that essentially the way you fix open source sustainability is just throw money at every open source project and that fixes all the problems, right? It doesn't. I've seen it in Homebrew, and I've seen it in many other projects and many other maintainers who are in my inbox, like trying to figure out how stuff done, right? In my experience, the way you fix open source sustainability is by figuring out what sustainability looks like for that particular open source project, right? And some of that comes from personal boundaries of the maintainers with each other, with the community, personal boundaries with maintainers in terms of like, what are we doing here? What are we trying to build, right? Are we going to do the Jamie Zawinski rule of like all software grows until it has an email client, right? Or are we going to say, no, this is the line beyond which we don't go, we're not interested, that's out of scope, use this other project, whatever it may be. And that's how you have to do this, because 10 years ago, Homebrew had probably like half the number of maintainers, maybe a third, but we had like maybe 1/10, if not much less than that, of the users, right? And the way you scale doing that, as John kind of mentioned and alluded to as well, is you do that by filing off the rough edges, right? And if you have a feature that blows up for users 10% of the time, right, there might be a bunch of power users who love that feature and it makes their life really happy and the workflows are great. But like if 10% of users who bump into that, even if like 0.1% of those users go and complain on our discussions, or like in the past when we had IRC channels or on our issue track or whatever, that gets very, very hard for 30 people to manage, right? And the only way in the end, like I've been, you will find various parts of the internet that don't like me very much for this viewpoint, but in the end, to me, the only way you are able to successfully scale that is you say some of these features go away, right? If you want to build a plugin or support your own way of doing things over here, that's fine. But in the open source project, we do not have the infrastructure to do this stuff. Like we can't do it. And if you just gave us more money, that doesn't solve the problem either, because you end up in this, I should probably come up with a better name for it, but like this sort of open source sustainability money-wise gulf of like too much money for stickers, not enough money to pay anyone, right? Where like if you don't have even one person's full-time salary coming in reliably, but you've got way too much, like what do you do with that? And how do you use that to somehow magically scale the project so that everyone is able to do more with less or the same amount, right? But I think on the business side, that's when it gets interesting, because you can go and build a business where most businesses, well, not most businesses, certainly our business, you start from the outset with a model of looking at being like, well, ultimately, we are going to have to build something and we're going to have to charge people money for a product. And in exchange for that product, like they are going to get a great user experience that they don't otherwise get, right? And to me, like that's another way that you build sustainability, both for open source and for dev tools in general, right? Like GitHub as a, if you look at GitHub, the offering on GitHub nowadays and how many billions of features they have and CI runners and all this type of thing, you couldn't do that with a bunch of volunteers. Like you can do that with 30 volunteers working evenings and weekends, right? Like maybe their initial offering in 2007 or 8 or whatever it was, you could have done that. You maybe could have sustained that indefinitely with like a small number of people just doing things in their best effort, but you wouldn't scale that to, like hundreds of millions of users for sure. Like all of that stuff requires many, many people having a level of dedication that is not really compatible with them having a full-time job doing something else.
Yeah, it makes sense what you're saying there about like how unless you're paying people the full salary, like money's not really going to help like do that, and that you do need a company to go and like give those extra features that maybe not so many people need, that cause a lot of problems, and you're willing to do all the boring fiddly things that big companies need, and that is not fitting for open source. It makes so much sense. This is very cool. I honestly, like, I hadn't really seen this sort of model or like really thought about this. Maybe is probably the right way. I'd seen it, I guess, but not thought about it. It's very cool, and it seems like you're not going to have to worry about really any of the kind of issues that a lot of open source companies have with like monetizing the project. It's very cool. And we're kind of running out of time, but I just wanted to ask, like, who are you like kind of selling to? It's like IT departments or how?
Yeah, so there are really three types of people that are interested in Workbrew. Obviously, first and foremost, it's a developer. Homebrew is incredibly popular with developers on Macs, and at the minimum, there are developers out there that work at companies where they have security and compliance requirements that prevent them from using Homebrew. Imagine trying to do your work without access to Homebrew, how much less productive you would be. So really, one of the core values that we provide is just the ability for engineers that work in companies with these security and compliance requirements to have access to the tools that they already know and love and use. In addition, for engineers, we aim to make the collaborative development process better, help them get up and running faster, and really make it so that it's a treat your local developer environment like it's infrastructure. And the idea being that I have worked in VMs, I've worked in Docker containers, I've worked in cloud IDEs, and they all have a trade-off in that you get consistency, speed of startup, all those types of things in exchange for worse ergonomics. I love working on my local machine with my local editor, on my local file system, with my local network, with all the things that are ergonomic and the way that I like them. And anytime I introduce a Docker or VM or Cloud ID or anything like that into my workflow, it drains me. It makes me less productive. In addition, all of those options cost more. They're either you're paying for VMs, you're using more battery life, you're using more processor, you're doing whatever. You have these really amazing Apple Silicon devices that you're paying $5,000 a pop for, and then you're shelling out into a cloud environment. Like, what are we even doing? Right? It doesn't make any sense. So that's the story for the developers. It's like have access and have really great ergonomics. The next big category of people is the IT managers. So these are the folks who, in your company, they're responsible for issuing you a laptop and making sure that you're up and running. And for engineers, oftentimes these people, you don't need to interact with them that much because you can self-serve, you can fix your own problems. I remember the IT department at GitHub was amazing. The people on that team, were there to support you when you needed them. They helped you with the inventory situation. They helped you with getting access to things. But at the end of the day, like we had the situation where we had a lot of talented engineers who knew what they were doing. So it was kind of a situation where they had a lot of trust and there was kind of a backup team to make sure things that were necessary got done. And so as IT managers, we want to give them a way to lighten their workload and be able to get Brew into the hands of their team in a reliable, repeatable, really easy way. And then once it's out there, know what's going on. Have visibility into how are people using this thing? Do I need to be worried that they're installing some software that could have a supply chain attack or things like that? And then the last kind of category of people that we're trying to serve are security professionals, whether it's a CISO or kind of somebody who's on the AppSec side, but they're interested in making sure their company is secure. We're building a bunch of functionality around making sure that you can meet your compliance standards. So there's SOC 2, there's ISO 27001, there's all the different kind of credit card compliant. Like there's all different industries have their compliance standards, and inevitably they intersect with the way people are using Brew. Whether it means the people on their devices are using admin accounts rather than standard users, and what's entailed with that, and how Brew interacts with that, or if it's about what pieces of software are being integrated into their workflows. So we're serving those people by saying, hey, look, you can get a high-level overview of everything that's happening. You can get alerts about when there are vulnerabilities. You can respond to those vulnerabilities. You can set policies and guidelines to make sure that the usage of these tools are contained. One of the really powerful features of Homebrew is that it's not tied to one library of packages. They're the official packages in Homebrew Core and Homebrew Cask, but you can actually add a third-party library called a tap and install any software with Homebrew. You can create your own taps. You can use taps by third-party vendors. And that represents, for security folks, a really, really big issue. They're like, oh my God, literally anything could be installed in the machines and I have no idea about it. And so, for them, we're making it so you can see, are people using third-party libraries, third-party taps? Which ones are they using? Do you have a control policy that you need to implement? So there's all kinds of stuff around there that's really valuable. And so, those are the people we're trying to serve. And I think that kind of the last thing I'll say about this is kind of the business model and like how we're trying to sell this. So we have pretty much two two stories. One is there's a free version and one there's a paid version. So Workbrew is available for free for unlimited users, unlimited devices. It's the best way to install Brew on a fleet. Whether you have 10 or 10,000 devices, you can go to Workbrew, you can install Brew on every device, have it be consistent, get it ready up and running in minutes, and have full visibility into everything that's being done on there. This is kind of like table stakes for any company that's doing any kind of SOC 2 compliance or any kind of good security practices, and we made that totally free. Then beyond that, if you want to add security controls, or if you want to add remote management, or if you want to have any kind of interaction around automation and default packages and kind of environment setup, then we have a paid plan that you can get additional features from. But it's really targeted at those three use cases.
Very cool. Very cool. Kind of reminds me of like Sneak in the sense of like the kind of model that I don't know if you've thought about it that way, but like I can totally imagine like I've had to use Sneak at work because we went through SOC 2 compliance, and it was like just like my manager loved it because you can just everything is like compliant, fits in with Vanta and stuff like that. And then for me, it was like generally good because a lot of the time you just press a button, upgrade and stuff rather than like solving it yourself. But yeah, that's very cool. It's very, very exciting. Yeah, and thank you so much for sharing the journey, and and thanks thanks Mike for helping us download all the stuff we need onto our Macs. So yeah, thank you, John and Mike, and thanks everyone for listening. So workbrew.com if people want to learn more.
Yep. Check out workbrew.com, and thank you so much for having us on the podcast. We're really grateful to be here and have this conversation. And look forward to coming back at some point in the future and giving you an update.
Amazing.
Yep. Thanks, Jack, and thanks everyone for listening.